We're now going to spring forward in philosophical history a bit. After wrapping up with Eastern philosophy, we're going to pick up where we left off in Western philosophy and speed through the Dark Ages, as it were. I don't want to make too much of the label Dark Ages, although certainly it is the case that there wasn't as much intellectual activity as there was in the preceding millennium. It's not true, in fact, of course, that there was no philosophy done at all, or that there was nothing of significance happening intellectually. That there was a lot less is probably certainly the case, however. So although we're not going to cover any one in particular between the Stoics and Thomas Aquinas, or really St. Anselm, so at about 1100 AD, with the advent of the modern university. Even though that's the case, there is some philosophical history to be had there, but we're going to skip that in favor of the major figures, beginning with Aquinas. Briefly, though, during that 700-year span, from about 400 to 1100 AD, the Western world was characterized by a certain degree of political instability, of course, following the fall of Rome, however long that happened to have taken, whether it was a discrete event or something that happened over a period of time. Regardless, the intellectual climate changed significantly. It changed significantly with the political instability and also the advent of Christian rulership. Intellectual growth in the West, and in Europe in particular, was somewhat stunted, you might say, for some time, and changed character considerably. We get early theological concerns and debates in philosophy in the form of Augustine and Boethius, and so on. And the intellectual activity that was there existed. I believe a decent way of characterizing this is that it was closer to the church and the church's concerns than the philosophy was before that time. So one might study it more properly under the heading of theology, for instance, or religious history. That being said, a lot of the texts that we still have from the previous period, from the golden age of Greek philosophy, survived in libraries and monasteries, not infrequently outside of Europe. Oftentimes we didn't even know that the texts were there. You know, they disappeared into the catacombs, more or less, for long periods of time. And this allowed them to survive through a period that was somewhat antagonistic to the pagan mind in any of its forms, including ancient Greek philosophy. The reason that I want to pick up with Anselm in this vein is that he was one of the first philosophers, or I should say one of the first figures in general, really, inside the church, to make it acceptable to do philosophy again. You see, the environment before this time was somewhat antagonistic to intellectualism generally, and especially intellectualism with respect to ancient Greek philosophy. So it took some time, and it took some convincing and some cultural changes to really hurry this along and make it possible for people to do philosophy proper again. Tarnas does a good job, I believe, of describing this period in a great deal more detail than we can afford to, simply because of the constraints of time in this course. So you'll notice that the reading assignment for this part of the course is considerably longer than it is for the surrounding material, since we are skipping a good bit of history in favor of hitting some of the more influential figures later on. So Greek philosophy, with Aristotle and Plato and the like, was slowly rediscovered, and we can trace, as Tarnas does, through Western intellectual progress in the early university system and its movements, its intellectual movements, by looking at the Greek philosophy and looking at the texts that were available to them at the time. And we can see that through a slow rediscovery of this material, the climate changed. Now, this is something that we're still familiar with. We can see even as late as the 19th century, when we start getting a lot more material from the ethnographers around the world, from the East, in the form of Buddhism in particular, we can see a number of philosophers being influenced by this. Schopenhauer and his lineage in particular shows a fairly obvious intellectual debt to the Eastern thinkers. Although one can argue, and I think quite tenably, that the West was already moving somewhat in this direction with Kant and the trajectory that was prescribed there. And we'll get to to Kant shortly in the course. The early university system is something that is worth mentioning because, of course, the early university system is what eventually allowed for a flourishing again, a renaissance, a rebirth of philosophical and intellectual activity in general in the West. And the earliest universities grew from the church. The clergy were the only ones that could teach there. They were the only ones that could attend. Latin was the official language, which is an incredibly practical choice to make it very easy across Europe for people to understand one another. Eminently practical, you might say, especially since communication is rather difficult. And being that Latin is a dead language, or was already a dead language by that time, it was very easy then to prevent the language from morphing into something that would allow one's neighbors to separate sufficiently so that you could no longer understand them. Okay. If you're following along in your PowerPoint, you can see here another salient issue for the early universities is that Aristotle was not allowed even to be studied. The idea of studying a pagan philosopher was not in vogue, you might say. And Aquinas really made it possible and acceptable to study Aristotle again. And this was a slow push. There were a lot of intellectuals, a lot of monks really, that were interested in ancient Greek philosophy because they actually had the opportunity to read it. They were the ones that were the keepers of it and had the literacy, the capability of reading it and copying it and whatnot. We even hear of one individual that wanted to call Socrates Saint Socrates if it wouldn't have been heresy, and this gives you some idea of the esteem to which Socrates was already held. And Aristotle, similarly in the early university system, was called the philosopher. So if someone referred to the philosopher, they were talking about Aristotle, which is a pretty significant mark of respect, I should think, for a single man. So that gives you some idea of Aristotle's influence on the intellectual climate of the time, despite the fact that he was, hundreds of years before the time of Christ. So it took some synthesis, you might say, and work of Aquinas and others to make philosophy acceptable and to make it acceptable for Christian intellectuals to study non-Christian philosophy. All right. The earliest university, some of the earliest university work, and when we're talking about Aquinas here, it doesn't take us very long before we get to something that's very similar to the style of writing that we know and love today in the university system, and that of, I'm speaking in particular of writing articles, journal articles, where one cites profusely the other authorities in the discipline, basically providing you with a kind of intellectual shorthand to refer to common ideas that have already been well reviewed and explained in the literature, and allows you then to do that as quickly as possible and then make your contribution to that discussion. And Aquinas really gave us this in a much fuller form than it was before his time. Now, another point, we begin really with Platonism, in that a priori reasoning was the mode of the early university thinkers. And we can see a heavy Platonic influence. And then, of course, as Aristotle is rediscovered, we see a shift. So it's tracing a trajectory much like what we saw in the ancient Greek world when these people actually flourished, where Plato arrives first. We have an emphasis on a priori reasoning, and that reasoning, which is not based upon experience, which is one's reason alone, working entirely from the mind, moving forward then to Aristotle, forward in time to Aristotle and his method of reasoning a posteriori from empirical evidence, from empirical experience, and this is really what sets us up nicely for the movement into scientific thinking that we're familiar with today, as our science is largely, in this way, Aristotelian. All right, the ontological argument is something that we should mention in the context of of this discussion, because this is one of the first arguments, one of the first formal arguments that we see for the existence of God. And perhaps not surprisingly, when we see the resurgence of philosophy, we begin seeing more of an emphasis on the existence arguments. So it's almost as though philosophy begged the question of how do we know that God exists? And Anselm answers this, saying that God is something which contains every perfection, exemplifies every perfection. And so nothing greater can be imagined, nothing greater can be thought than the idea of God. And he further argues that a thing is not as great if it doesn't exist. So God would not be as great, would not be perfectly great if he didn't exist, therefore God exists. This is somewhat of a simplification of the argument, but this will give you an idea, a flavor at least, for the way that this is typically treated. Now, this is something that people not infrequently look at for the first time and say, well, that's interesting, maybe even plausible. It's curious, especially as an a priori argument, using exclusively a priori reasoning. This is not based upon empirical experience, empirical observation. Now, you might argue that knowledge of every perfection and what that could possibly mean must rely on some experience, and that's certainly one way of thinking about it and one potential critique for this. The way that this is usually attacked, though, is by taking a look at the second premise there. As you see, a great thing is not as great if it doesn't exist. This implies that existence is somehow greater than non-existence, and that existence is a perfection, perhaps. This is frequently the way this is stated. And a lot of people then look at this and say, well, maybe not so much. But one of the other popular objections is the island example, in saying that I'm imagining, instead of a God, I'm imagining an island that contains every perfection and exemplifies greatness in every way that an island can. The size being one of those pieces. Well, why would the island need to be infinitely sized? I mean, that's obviously ridiculous. And that such an island should exist is practically a contradiction in terms. So it's that, I think, is one way of approaching it. And that was offered not long after Anselm originally proposed the argument. All right. Now, before we get into Aquinas, one of the things that I want to suggest here is that, and this is a potential discontinuity as well for the way that Aquinas approaches the situation and a way that a lot of modern thinkers, especially modern Christian thinkers, approach the situation. Aquinas, you'll notice, has a particular definition for God, and this is something that has been used throughout time with some success, specifically that he is all-powerful, all-loving, and all-knowing. And I think generally, if you ask people who are in the Christian tradition, is this the case? Is God all-powerful? Is God all-knowing and all-loving? And I think you'll find generally the intuitive response to that is yes. However, that may not be entirely an accurate characterization for what the philosophical argumentation wants to do with this. In other words, when people think about this, I don't believe they think about it in such discrete terms, in such exhaustive terms, as if we were trying to set down the final definition for God. I don't think most people think about it in that way. And so simply answering the question, is God all loving, for instance? Well, yes, that's an easy one. Since we frequently hear in that the New Testament content is based upon love. The emphasis is love. And so the idea of an all-loving God seems to be very natural and consonant with that kind of thinking. However, some of the philosophical implications that follow from something that is all-loving, all-compassionate, and also all-powerful and all-knowing, it's interesting. So we'll see this very plainly, I think, when we get to the problem of evil next time, because part of the argument, or part of the formal argument, as it can be phrased for the problem of evil, uses this definition. Nevertheless, this basically brings us back to the same question. What is God? Who is God? What is God? How do you define God? How do you say anything philosophical about the nature of God, about the concept of God? What can we really say about it? This is, I think, a very interesting question for these arguments. Because if we're going to be arguing something philosophically, and presumably if we're going to be arguing something logically in particular, you've got to have your terms defined. And so if you don't have the term God defined, then it makes it very difficult to reason logically with it. Now, that is not necessarily a deficiency from a Christian standpoint, because it may be the case that it's not possible to define what God is. So that is certainly one way of addressing these arguments and addressing philosophy in general, you might say, with respect to this concept, if it in fact is limited in some significant way by logic. So that's something to think about. One of the stories that I like to tell with this is of a professor back in the 1950s, I believe it was, who was more or less put on trial, sort of a trial of his peers, for preaching atheism. And this is something, of course, that philosophers are rather famous for. So this is a friendly story for this concept. So it was asked of him, okay, you're accused of preaching atheism to your students. You're accused of forwarding heresy, essentially. Do you believe in God? And the professor responds immediately, saying, well, what do you mean by God? And that's kind of the end of that. Because ultimately, most of the time, I think when people ask the question, do you believe in God? It's more or less implied that we're not going to have to define God, because that's just too difficult. And if someone probes further, then the interrogator might say, well, the Christian God, obviously. Okay, well, the Christian God as defined by whom? And this is really a relevant question, isn't it? I mean, as defined by which sect, we could say. Okay, as defined by which sect? Let's say, I don't know, Presbyterian. Okay, well, as defined by which preacher? As defined by, which person, which area of the world, which interpretation. And you can see the problem, I think, very quickly with this, is that the God concept is not something that lends itself very easily to definition. And people in general use it without, most of the time, I would argue, having a very discrete concept of what it is. Now, again, this is not necessarily a direct attack. This is not a problem. If, in fact, it is possible to sensibly use language in such a way that we do not have to discretely define all of our concepts. And this is something that we'll get to with some of the logicians later in the semester. To give you a taste of this, Wittgenstein in particular brings up the idea of, for instance, game. The word game is a devil to define. It's really very difficult to define this word. In fact, it may be almost impossible for us to define this word. I mean, to take an easier example, perhaps, love. Good luck defining it. As Campbell says, amusingly, Joseph Campbell says, okay, so love. Well, only a fool spends much time talking about love, so I'll be brief. And that may be the case with God as well. I mean, what are we really talking about? I think it's clear that most people do not walk around carrying a dictionary-style definition of God. And that poses a certain discontinuity with the kind of philosophical thinking that I think Aquinas was headed toward, and I think frequently is used, or at least was frequently used in armchair philosophy against Christianity. Because if you set up a definition of God, it's a lot easier to attack it. So from an atheist standpoint, you want to have a definition of God. It's much easier to deal with when you do. On the other hand, from a Christian standpoint, and if we were to invoke any sort of notion that the concept is in any way ineffable, in other words, if there is some aspect of it that is beyond words, then ultimately any kind of definition is going to be impossible. Now, which side of that, holds water, which side of that is tenable, either from a philosophical or religious standpoint, it really depends on who you talk to. Aquinas is unusual in that he seems to be both a philosopher that comes from the almost a logician standpoint, but also argues in favor of the existence of God. Nevertheless, you can have any mix of those properties. So it really is very much up in the air. But I think one of the central questions, and this is what I wanted to bring out, is that the definition of God is not cut and dry. It's not clean, and it varies frequently depending upon who you ask and maybe even what time of day you happen to ask them. It may be the case that there is something numinous, something mystical, something ineffable about the concept itself and one's relation to the divine in general that resists philosophical and or simply logical definition. So nevertheless, that's part of the framework that we're working from here. So realize that early on with this, we're taking kind of the simplified approach. When we're talking about the existence of God, we're talking about the existence of God from Aquinas' point of view, where God is defined as all-powerful, all-loving, and all-knowing, the usual sort of definition for this time. Okay, so moving on to Aquinas in particular. Aquinas obviously loved Greek philosophy, and he did what he could to bring it back and make it possible to study again in an orthodox fashion. And so Aquinas is somewhat famous for his work and at least his perceived success in synthesizing philosophy and theology, thus the beatification, thus the sainting of him. Since he is Saint Thomas Aquinas, this gives you some idea of how highly the Catholic Church held him in esteem. Now, the arguments that Aquinas gave were not so much to convince himself, but to help theologians and to help people in general to bolster theology. In other words, to strengthen it, not to cover up a weakness necessarily. So in other words, Aquinas argued that philosophy could be used in the service of theology, and that many of these papers, and we get this as late as Descartes, for instance, if we read the dedication for the Meditations, it's basically assumed that Christianity is right, that the theology in Christianity is sound, and he is simply, whoever the thinker might be, is simply offering this as, an extra argument, something that can be given on top of the theological arguments that are already given. In other words, for those unbelievers who, what is out there in theology is not enough, here's some material in philosophy that may help. So it's taken generally in that context. And so we're really back to a almost pre-Socratic view on this. Remember, as we got towards Aristotle in philosophical history, the divine largely had fallen out of the picture. And one can certainly argue that it had not fallen out completely by the time of Aristotle, but nevertheless, the pre-Socratics obviously made greater use, I think, of, for instance, with Parmenides writing in verse, Thales and Heraclitus speaking of Zeus and the gods, and everything being suffused with the divine. The religion was much more an integral part of their thinking and of philosophy at the time. And as we approach Aristotle chronologically, this begins to fall away. Well, by the time we get to Aquinas, it's almost as though we're back to where we started, where Christianity is basically assumed. And we argue from that standpoint then, for a lot of these, for a lot of the early Christian thinkers. Now, this may not be all that terribly surprising if you consider that intellectualism grew out of the church in particular, and those that studied it to this extent, not infrequently, were monks. So obviously, if you were a monastic individual, a monastically inclined person, you were probably simply you're probably already convinced by Christianity. Your faith is already very strong, so why would you begin with anything else? It's not, I think, until the education of those outside of the church becomes more popular, more available, and you might even say simply more possible with the political stability and relative ensuing affluence and peace, that people really begin thinking and not assuming so much with respect to Christianity and the religion and the church. So we begin inside the religion more or less, as with the pre-Socratics, and then move slowly away from that until by the time we get to really Descartes is where we start to see a sharp division. And this is not necessarily true with Descartes himself, but he sets the stage for someone to do this. And and we'll talk about that more when we get to Descartes and what's novel about his thinking in particular. He sets the stage for someone to really begin reasoning and perhaps in such a way that is acceptable without assuming anything about religion and Christianity. So, again, moving back to Aquinas, the existence of God, the existence of God arguments may seem kind of simple in relation to trying to understand the history that surrounds them, and hopefully you get that impression. I think this is perhaps the case. The arguments are relatively simple logically. Beginning with number one, the cosmological argument. This is something that you're all probably very familiar with. This is the argument by causation, and this is still a very popular argument. Now, it is a popular argument for the proof of something, and that is really an important point when we're talking about the existence arguments with Aquinas. Aquinas believed that all five of the existence arguments were necessary in order to prove the existence of the Christian God, because any of the arguments alone prove simply one aspect. And so you have to have them all taken together before you get the Christian God. If you argue using only the cosmological argument, you don't necessarily get the Christian God. You get something. Something was the first causer. So anyway, the argument goes like this. The existence of everything that we see in the world is the result of its being caused by something else. And this goes back and regresses, you might say, logically, so that, A was caused by B, B was caused by C, C was caused by D, and so on back in time. Aquinas reasons that this series cannot continue indefinitely, and therefore there must have been something to have caused everything to begin to exist in the beginning. And that something, of course, is going to be God. And this is a first causer. Now, the only conclusion that one can draw from this form of the cosmological argument is that something caused this to exist. It doesn't say whether that thing is still around. It doesn't say whether that thing is all-powerful. It doesn't say any other detail about it. It may not even be good. It may be an evil demon. At this point, we don't know. It's just that if you buy into the cosmological argument, the conclusion is only that you have a first cause, a first causer. All right. The teleological argument. Teleological argument is also very popular today. This is the argument by design. Now, this was, I think, a good deal more popular in previous centuries than it is now, since we tend to look at the universe in very different terms as a result of the advancements in physics. And the advancements in the sciences tend to bring about changes in the intellectual climate, especially with respect to physics. But we'll get into that in more detail, because that's really an important point, and this is especially something that's crucial in understanding the modern mindset, how it is that we think today, and just how much it's influenced by the sciences, and in particular by physics. So the teleological argument, the argument by design, is that, okay, there's order in the universe. We observe order in the universe. We look out and we see order, whether it's the plants, the nicely ordered and balanced ecosystems, or simply, as the argument goes, or one example of the argument goes, finding a pocket watch on the beach. We find sand and various other things, and we don't tend to assume necessarily that there's a lot of order involved there. It does look kind of chaotic. But if you pick up a pocket watch, you probably don't assume that it just blinked into existence as a random combination of elements. When you see a pocket watch, you probably assume that someone put it together and eventually lost it. So in other words, you assume that there was a human designer and that it probably got there because someone at some point took that item that was created by someone else probably and misplaced it. It ended up on the beach. Nevertheless, the idea is that when we see order in the universe, we don't assume that it just happened by random chance. We know that with the things that we're familiar with, pocket watches, computers, and things of this kind now, these things didn't come to be simply by chance. We know that there was a designer. And so when we look at the order that exists in the universe, it stands to reason then, according to this argument, that something must have given order to the universe. And of course, that ordering intelligence will eventually become God, something that is powerful enough to give order to the universe. The argument by motion is very similar. Everything has a certain energy, a certain motion associated with it. And this motion always happens as a result of something else. And so there must have been at one point a first mover. Same kind of reasoning. The argument by necessity is a bit more difficult, I think. In general, for people, for students, this is not as intuitive and not as obvious, and it's certainly not as popular in our culture right now. The idea with the argument by necessity is that if nothing existed, nothing would continue to exist. Nothing is created ex nihilo. In other words, nothing is created out of nothing. And if everything exists contingently, so if it is possible for everything in the world to exist or not exist, and we see this with the different things in the world, that everything comes to pass, everything arises and then passes. So it must then be the case that at one time, nothing would exist at all. If it was possible for everything not to exist, then eventually out of all those random combinations, you would end up with a time where nothing existed. And since you can't have creation ex nihilo, there must be something that exists that's eternal. So this argues then that the deity in question that is being formed by these arguments must be eternal. So in other words, he's still around, beyond time, you might say. All right. Now the argument by gradation is an interesting. This is one which is especially crucial for Aquinas because this gets you a good God. This ensures that the deity is good rather than evil. But at the same time, this is probably the least popular of his 5 arguments because it involves assumptions that we're not so ready to go along with, I think. Everything is capable of being compared according to its value. In other words, there are some things that are better than others, and there are some things that have a greater ontological status, let's say. And there are some things that are better or worse that we can judge by these standards. Now, for any given standard, we must have some maximum in mind somewhere. And otherwise, the standard would have no frame of reference and it would be meaningless. So for anything that has a property, there must be a maximum of that property. There must be something that instantiates the extreme of that particular property. And thereby, with goodness, because we don't see anything else in the world that is maximally good, there must exist something that is maximally good. And presumably this is God. Now, of course, this might beg the question, if you're following along here, there must also exist something that is maximally evil. But hold that thought for just a moment. We'll get to some of the objections in the next slide. The idea that things are comparable and that some things are better than others implies a kind of value judgment that we're not accustomed to making. And this is seen as being similar to, or based upon, the great chain of being sort of concept. And we don't really subscribe to that now. That's not the way that we tend to think about the world. So this is not as popular and has not been as popular of an argument. Okay. To quickly go over some of the common objections to the existence argument, so that when we get to a discussion of this, we can be well armed with both what Aquinas had to say in favor of them and what people typically have to say in opposition to them. The outside of Aquinas, first, the ontological argument I mentioned, existence. Frequently people argue that existence is not a perfection. And furthermore, if the categories that we use are arbitrary or worse, or simply based upon our thinking, then this doesn't really work. In other words, if the categories that we use are more indicative of the way that we think and the way that we relate to the world than the way that the world actually is, then one can't argue for something like God based upon our categories and the perfections of our categories. moving on to Aquinas' arguments, the cosmological argument and the argument by motion. I mentioned the cosmological argument is very popular, so this is something to keep in mind. And how often do you hear the cosmological argument being given and someone, mentioning this kind of thing quickly in response, or perhaps even as part of the argument and trying to account for it? Mathematically now, we deal with the concept of infinite series very easily. And so we know that infinite series are possible, and you can even have an infinite series that counts up to a finite number. If you remember Zeno's paradoxes, and this was the case of the geometric series that is important for solving that particular riddle. So the cosmological argument argues that the series of causes can't go on forever. Well, now we can look at that and say, well, okay, why not? Why couldn't it go on forever? I mean, do we know better somehow that this must have had a beginning? What makes us think that it did? So that is a popular objection to that, and motion is the same way. The teleological argument with respect to the pocket watch, we recognize that the pocket watch has order, but when a crab encounters a pocket watch on the beach, he probably doesn't care if it's a shell or a pocket watch or a rock or anything else. It's simply another object on the beach. And the point here is that the order that we observe because we were the ones that put it there. In other words, we thought to do things like this, and we recognize our own craft. How then are we supposed to understand any kind of notion that a deity might have with respect to order? Why should our notion of order have anything to do with the divine notion of order if there is a supernatural distinction here? In other words, if there is a God whose mind, so to speak, is entirely beyond ours, what makes us think that our notion of order would bear any relation to that deity's? So, there again, it shouldn't be surprising to us that we find order in the world because that's the way that we think. Our mind is set up to discern between things and discriminate and create categories and objects and whatnot for us. And so it shouldn't be at all surprising that we observe order in the world. That's just the way that our mind works. The argument by necessity, the idea of creation ex nihilo is something that we're not as, we don't have as many problems with today, I think, and this is a result of quantum physics, at least in part. The idea of something simply coming into existence, having a short existence, and then blinking out of existence. If you think about the quantum phone, for instance, one interpretation of this is as such. So the idea of being and non-being is no longer quite so cut and dry as it was, you might say. Also, the principle of plenitude, that if you have enough time, sort of the monkeys and typewriters theory with Shakespeare, you're eventually going to hit the random combination that you want. And this assumes that things are random, and that there is nothing that is dependent such that it would prevent the completely non-existent case from ever occurring. The TV guide objection is a really easy thing to understand, I think, with respect to this formulation of this thought. It's possible for a show to exist and then later on not to exist. So in other words, it's not on, then it's on, and then it's not on again. But there's always something on. So it's not necessarily the case then that this reasoning doesn't guarantee us that the completely non-existent case is going to ever occur, and even if it does occur, that it's going to persist. Gradation, I mentioned some of the arguments there. If the standard is arbitrary, again, like order, then the argument is as well. All right. Now, Pascal's wager is something that I want to mention. I have this as a final note, sort of to clean up this particular topic. This is a very popular argument that is given in defense of the discrete or exclusivist soteriologies. And what Pascal's wager basically says is that, well, even if I can't say for sure that God exists, isn't that the way to bet? Wouldn't I rather, if I'm right, then, I go to heaven. And if I'm wrong, well, nothing happens. On the other hand, if you're right, nothing happens. And if you're wrong, you go to hell. that seems not so much of a fair trade. So, isn't this the way to bet? And the unfortunate thing is, while this seems to be kind of an intuitive argument and can be and is often perceived as being very powerful, even by people who should know better, the one objection that can be given to this is that if you simply consider two different and completely incompatible soteriologies, then the argument is made impossible. So even if we can't prove that the Christian God exists, and then give the argument that way, and then continue that with, let's say, even if we can't prove that that Allah exists, or even if we can't prove that the magic leprechaun exists, let's say I made up my own soteriology, the argument is just as powerful for any made-up theological system as it is for those that are more popular. And if you can't tell the difference between them, then it's impossible to know which way to bet. So that's something that's worth mentioning. All right. Nevertheless, one of the things that I want to impress upon you with respect to these arguments, and the reason that that we go over them, even though this is a relatively easy topic in comparison to some of the other stuff that we've done, is that this is a very popular topic, and this is something that you're likely to encounter with some frequency as you go through schooling and indeed life in general. These kind of arguments are given all the time, and it's important, I think, and to your advantage, to be familiar with the way that they have been argued, and the way that people have objected to them, and the way that people have supported them. If you're familiar with the commentary on these things, then you don't have to reinvent the wheel. And so when someone proposes to you the cosmological argument, instead of having to think it through yourself as though no one had ever thought of it before, do some reading about it, Find out what Aquinas said in favor of it. Find out what others have said in opposition to it, so that you're not having to be as clever as the sum total of all people who have ever thought about it, so to speak. You can kind of skip to the end and start working on some novel content of your own, rather than having to reinvent what some of the great minds of the past 1,000 years or so have thought about this. This is true in general with philosophical concepts, but I think this is especially obvious. One might even argue painfully obvious with respect to the existence arguments, because they are given so often in popular culture, but they are so rarely justified and supported, even for or against them. I'm not saying either way, but they're so very rarely argued in a way that reflects philosophical history. People continually try to reinvent the wheel with these things, and it's just not necessary. These arguments have been around for centuries, and people have thought hard on these things, and there's a lot of people that are very smart that have thought extensively on these topics, so it makes sense, I think, to be familiar with their thoughts and their arguments and commentary, so you can begin fresh, trying to build on the shoulders of giants, so to speak. That's kind of the idea of research in general, and that ties in nicely with Aquinas's writing, since he very much embodied the spirit of what it is that we hope to accomplish by doing that sort of writing in modern academic circles.